Welcome to Mushroom Mondays. I'm Mike, co-founder of Spore Life Sciences, and I will be your host today. Today, we're going to have a very special guest, Lorne Gertner, co-founder of PharmaCann, which is now Cronos, one of the leading licensed producers, as well as Tokyo Smoke, a leading cannabis retailer and brand, among several others. We're going to be discussing his entrepreneurial journey and some of the health benefits that are derived from consuming cannabis. Lorne, how you doing today? Thanks for joining us. Can you hear us there, Lorne?
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear a thing before.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. We're glad to have you. So kind of diving in, Lorne, when you started in the cannabis space, I think it's safe to say the industry was still very gray and has definitely come a long way from, black market narcotic to socially accepted medicine for a lot of people. Do you recall what year you began in the space and what was it like at that time?
Formally, I started getting involved in the space in 1998. So in 1998, the Canadian government was forced through a constitutional issue to provide medical cannabis. And that was when I first sort of realized that there was this activist movement that had been pushing for medical marijuana. And they won this case. And as a result of it, the Canadian government was forced to provide medical marijuana. And they didn't know what to do, so they came up with a program and they gave out an RFP for one company to grow cannabis for the government. And then the government would distribute it to people that had medical prescriptions. And so I was fascinated by that. And I thought this is something that I'm really interested in. And so I researched the company that had won the RFP. That company was called Prairie Plant Systems. And I cold called them and said, I want to come out and see your business. And they said, well, we're not really allowed to show it to anybody. Who are you? And why do you want to do this? And I said, well, I'm an investor. I'm I'm a known commodity, and I'm somebody that's really interested in possibly investing in your business. And he said, well, I don't know that I'm really looking for somebody. And I said, listen, in my world, people are always looking for money. And I convinced Brett Zettel, as the gentleman, to allow me to come out and visit his facility.
That's super fascinating. What sort of inspired you to get involved in the industry? I mean, was it just kind of on a whim? You thought, it was cool?
No. I had been a big advocate of medical marijuana or marijuana, and I'd been involved in it recreationally and was really curious and believed passionately that there was something more to marijuana than what was being talked about at the time. Remember, we were coming off the war on drugs, and there was a huge stigma around it. And yet, for me, it was something that helped me deal with anxiety. It helped me deal with sleep, helped me deal with a number of things. And I thought, I'm not that unusual. Mm-hmm. I think this, and also I'd done research that people have been using it for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And up until the war on drugs, nobody was really, everybody was using it both medically and recreationally and spiritually.
Absolutely, yeah. And so was Prairie Plant Systems your sort of first foray into cannabis, or like where did you?
It was my first investment. I mean, I went out and met and saw it, and I couldn't believe that. There was this 10,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility growing cannabis. Mm-hmm. And what I realized is that they were approaching it from, from a plant. And they were early on this idea of plant-made pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. And yet they knew nothing about the recreational market. And they also knew nothing about the plant other than they knew a lot about the plant, but they didn't know how to use the plant. And so in those days, most of the people using the plant were smoking it. And Prairie Plant ended up grinding it into almost a powder to get consistency. Mm-hmm. So they believed, and the truth is that from one bud to the next bud to the next bud, and from one flower to the next flower, they're different. And so their theory at the time was, if we grind it all up together, then we'll have consistency. What they didn't realize is that you have to grind cannabis in a certain way to get consistency so you can smoke it. Mm-hmm. And so they were grinding it to a powder. And so I realized at that point that I had a lot to add to the equation, because I knew the plant well and I knew, how to treat it. And so we decided to make an investment in Prairie Plant Systems, and then to use that investment to build the medical market. So remember, again, this was a brand new program. There were no patients, mm-hmm. and at the same time, there was no product. So now there was product, but it was, you had to build a patient population. Mm-hmm. And so we started doing, the first thing we started doing was looking at alternative delivery systems. Now, remember, this is 2000, 2001. Mm-hmm. And we looked at, and we drew pictures of a vape pen, of gum, of a patch, of a Listerine spray.
And that stuff didn't exist back then.
Didn't even exist. We were making it up. But we knew that people ate it, and we knew that people were vaping it, right? Because by that time the volcano was out, mm-hmm. right? And so you could see that people understood that you could vape it. And we could also see that in the black market, there was an edible market. Mm-hmm. So we thought, what does the future of that look like? And so I remember designing the first vape pen, and it looks very much like the one we use today. And this was in, early 2000. Mm-hmm.
That's incredible. You guys are really pioneering.
So it was really, and as that started to develop, our first premise was to build and educate the customers on a medical basis. Mm-hmm. The second one was to create alternative delivery systems for smoking. We knew even back then that smoking was an issue, smoking cigarettes was an issue, mm-hmm. and that it was going to become an issue or a potential issue from a medical point of view. Mm-hmm. Here you are trying to create a medicine, and you're telling people to smoke it. So we started looking at alternative delivery systems.
That makes perfect sense. And so, you've always had a big emphasis on design and aesthetic. In fact, you were involved in the fashion industry as well as architecture and real estate. How did you sort of marry that world with what you're doing in cannabis?
I think it started before cannabis, was that I developed a passion or a mission out of architecture school, which guided me through fashion and then into other things I did, which was that we could make the world a better place through design excellence. And so by adding design to anything, I started out in the clothing business and ended up in the fashion business because we added design there. And by adding design, we created margin because our design was different from somebody else's design. Mm-hmm. And we also knew that design would overcome stigma. Mm-hmm. So if people liked the way it looked and they were attracted to it, then it would help overcome the stigma that was attached to, whatever industry, but certainly in the cannabis industry.
That makes perfect sense. Make it look and feel friendlier versus, kind of like the dark, shady notion people had before. So you could do that through design clearly, and clearly you've done that and accomplished that.
Yeah, in cannabis, it was very much about, in the black market, you'd get it in a baggie. Mm-hmm. And, lots of times the baggie was a used baggie. And, it didn't look very good. And all of a sudden we thought, okay, let's put it in a nice package.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put it in a really nice bag. Let's put it in a smell-proof bag. Let's put it in a bag that, wasn't environmentally bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so there was early on, if we were trying to, give it away, sell it, whatever, we were looking at how could we put it in a beautiful box with a beautiful logo on it. So it looked like it was something other than something you were sort of embarrassed about.
Absolutely. And I mean, branding is everything, right? As we know today with any industry, really. So one of the more, I guess, notable and recent design-focused brands you were involved with was Tokyo Smoke. But you've helped build a number of prolific cannabis brands and companies. What are some of the biggest challenges you've experienced in doing so?
I think the biggest challenge was finding people who could execute on the strategy. And so we were trying to take a black market and bring it to a legal market. And most of the people that were in the black market, what they knew was the black market in cannabis. They didn't necessarily know the internet. They didn't understand Facebook, Instagram, all of that. So they weren't current with what was happening from a technology point of view. They also weren't people that knew how to execute under strict guidelines. And so all of a sudden, Health Canada comes out with a program, and it's like, you had to be really, really, smart and agile to be able to navigate your way through their process.
Right. I imagine compliance was huge.
Compliance was huge. SOPs were huge. All of that kind of stuff. Now enters, people that knew about the plant now hooking up with, legal people.
Mm-hmm.
But there were no professionals in the industry, and there were no people that were coming into the industry that had come from, technology. And so a big key was for me being able to find people and build a team that could execute.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't my forte. My forte was putting it all together. I had been an operator in my past life, but was not looking to be an operator.
Mm-hmm.
So, a key for me was finding people that were willing to take a chance on a new industry and leave high-paying jobs and leave, secure environments to come into a newly emerging industry. And that was really like a key, point was when people started to look at it differently. And remember, I'm from a generation that grew up with it being illegal and people going to jail and a whole paranoia around it, where people like you, Michael, grew up and thought, man, what is this? This is, I don't have that stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's why people like you and other people were attracted to go into the industry, because they weren't mirrored in this, 30 or 40 or 50 years of the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I mean, for me, it was, less jaded. Even when I was coming up, obviously, it was still illegal. And, I definitely saw that kind of black market side of it. But, obviously, being only 32, we've had rec market already for a few years here. So I've also seen the other side, and kids coming up today. I mean, for them, it's going to be so normalized, I would hope, that, it's the same as alcohol or any other kind of controlled substance. It's, all in moderation, but ultimately, like, no seriously negative stigma behind it.
Yeah, I think that's what we've been doing for the past, call it 10 years.
Absolutely. And so, although there's obviously a huge recreational market now, a lot of people use cannabis for medicinal purposes, and in many ways, it's been life-changing for these patients. I know you've definitely interacted with a lot of people who found a lot of solace in cannabis. And so, what are some of the common ailments people use cannabis for? And do you use it yourself or just recreation?
I think that when I look back at what's happened, it was really the people that, in certain cases, were children, and certain cases were children that had, epilepsy, bunch of different, really terrible things going on, and they had tried everything. And nothing was working. And there were advocates back then that said, hey, try cannabis. And it was when they tried cannabis and they realized their seizures would stop, or their pain would stop, or it eased whatever ailment they had. And sometimes these were life-threatening things that they couldn't find anything else. And that was really a turning point, call it Rick Simpson oil and a number of other things that people had been working on for a long time, but couldn't get acceptance of it. And all of a sudden there were desperate people who said, I'll try anything. I'll do anything at this point, including smoking cannabis. So I think that was the beginning of medical cannabis taking off, because no matter how much stigma was attached to it, or how much, you could go to jail, all of that, when you're desperate, it doesn't matter to you.
And what do you have to lose?
That was the beginning of it. But then I think what happened was, as it became a little more accepted, people realized that it was incredible for anxiety, right? It was really, really good for sleep. I don't know how many people have said to me, hey, I've never used, cannabis, but I have trouble sleeping. What do you think? And I would say, listen, you got to try it, right? Because there's enough sort of anecdotal evidence around that it really helps people with their sleeping.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm one who's used it for sleep for many years, and it's helped me tremendously.
Right. So sleep was a big one. Anxiety was another big one. Pain was another big one. Right. And so if you sort of start with those three things, tell me somebody who doesn't have one of those things.
Yeah, hard to come by for sure. And
hard to come by.
And so, for all intents and purposes, you've been in this industry really since day one. How far has the research, in your opinion, come for the health benefits with cannabis since you began?
Yeah, I think it's come a long way, but I think what happened, and I think we're seeing it now, is it, started as sort of, spiritual, right? But then it really sort of went into what I'll call the medical phase. And that's why we had a program in Canada. That's how California had a program. It all started through medical. And even if you look at my first cannabis company, we were a pharmaceutical company. What we realized is that research was so expensive, and that, even the leader at the time, which was GW Pharmaceuticals, they had raised hundreds of millions of dollars, and they still weren't there, right? Because to go down the FDA process with a Schedule I narcotic is a really hard thing to do. And so, lo and behold, in the middle of all of that happening, and a whole bunch of companies being committed to medical cannabis, rec came about. And so we went from, medical cannabis, and I remember, being an early licensed producer in Canada, it was all about the medical patient, and clinics were being set up and doctors were being educated, and companies were going out and educating the doctors so that they would write prescriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Then rec came along and took over all of that. And so I think, I can't remember the statistics at the time, but we were having trouble getting 100,000 medical patients in Canada, which is nothing, but it had taken us like 5 years to get that.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden we had a rec consumer, right? And so all of the original companies said, okay, we're going to focus on rec now. And that was what's happened for the most part, call it for the past 5+ years. If you ask me, the biggest opportunity in cannabis is still medical cannabis. And so today I'm seeing less rec companies and I'm seeing much more medical companies who are actually focused on, call it CBN
Mm-hmm.
or CBD
Mm-hmm.
or the entourage effect. And, what different medical purposes is that good for? And that's the next big wave, is that as it becomes a medicine, it takes on a whole other life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, there was research in the early days, and then of course, rec market, people followed the money, dumping it to rec and sort of neglecting the medical side. But now people are very interested to know exactly what all the compounds within cannabis do, because as we know, there's over 20, active ingredients in cannabis that bind with our cannabinoid receptors. And so, I think the science is still young, and it sounds like, from what you've seen, it's sort of ramping up again, which is pretty reassuring and cool for sure.
Yeah, exciting.
Very exciting. So, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but there are so many ways to consume cannabis: smoking flower, extracts, taking pills, edibles. What's your preferred method for ingesting, and which do you think is best for a health and wellness standpoint?
I think, again, we're going through a lot of technology changes in extraction, and also the biggest thing forever and ever and ever, and what took a lot for people to understand, is that cannabis was oil-based.
Mm-hmm.
And so the extract from the plant comes in an oil form. And that's really hard to consume. So that's why smoking came about, was because you could heat the oil and smoke it, right? So you could, basically as a plant form, you're burning it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you're getting the effect. Okay. Now, in the past couple of years, we've had nanotechnology come along, and we've created water-soluble cannabis, both THC and CBD. And so I think as that develops, again, our delivery systems will change. And so, drinking it,
Mm-hmm.
Is a really good way to consume it. Right? Edibles are a good way to consume it. Right? As long as you can figure out the onset.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a long time, the biggest problem was with eating it is that you didn't know when it was going to take effect. So basically you would eat it and you would wait an hour, and then you'd be wasted. And there was no way to control it. So the beauty of smoking cannabis is you can self-titrate.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take some, and if you feel good, you can take some more. If you take some and you don't feel good, you wait a couple of minutes and it dissipates. All right. And so what we've been trying to do for years is replicate that same process without smoking it. And so if you have rapid onset and you can take a little bit and you can feel the effects, and then if you want more, you can take a little more and it affects you immediately, then it really becomes a different process of how you consume it.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, there's a funny meme out there. It's, with regards to edibles, it's like you take edibles, it's like, I don't feel it. You wait an hour, you take some more, I don't feel it. Hour later, call the ambulance,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not a good way to consume it. And that's why people end up in the hospital. That's why people end up, with so-called overdosing,
mm-hmm.
is because you don't know what the effect's going to be by consuming it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if if you can titrate or you can have rapid onset, then really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And then you start with a little bit and you take a little more, as opposed to taking a amount you don't know what the effects are going to be.
And speaking sort of to the entourage effect, because, a lot of people criticize, certain extracts for lacking some of the other compounds that pair very well together. What's kind of your take on, THC versus CBD?
I mean, I think they're two different drugs, right? If we want to call them drugs. And I think they're both effective on their own, but I honestly believe they're more effective when they're together.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that can be for, certain ailments. I love the idea of, a CBD cream,
mm-hmm.
right? I love CBD because you can take it and it has so many of the same attributes as cannabis, but you're not getting high.
Mm-hmm. It's non-psychoactive.
And so it's not psychoactive. And so I always, I said for years that CBD is the gateway drug,
mm-hmm.
right? Because I can get anybody to take CBD, right? Chances are, in my experience, within 6 months after them taking CBD, they start to say, okay, well, tell me more about THC.
Mm-hmm.
And then you explain to them about THC, and then you explain to them about the entourage effect. And, then you go from high CBD alone to high CBD with a little THC. And then depending on what you're using it for, you might go to a 1-to-1.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it's highly versatile in how you mix it.
That makes perfect sense. So where do you think the cannabis industry is heading next?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think, as we talked about before, I think we're heading into a medical realm,
mm-hmm.
which really excites me. I think at the same time, we're also headed into a consumer product life for cannabis. So certainly if you see it on the CBD side, it's become a consumer product,
mm-hmm.
right? And I think we'll see that as well on the, THC side. And that's why, the alcohol guys, the big CPG guys
mm-hmm.
are starting to get involved in the industry. And they've all bought, and made bets, whether it's the big tobacco companies
mm-hmm.
and the big alcohol companies have now, placed their bets in the cannabis industry. Or a lot of them have, where 10 years ago they wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm.
Then you see on the other side, the retail companies starting to place their bets, where you see, companies like Rexall or, Tooth Card, they start to acquire interest in this business because they believe in the retail side of the business. and the distribution side of the business. And all of a sudden you see Whole Foods carrying CBD, and you see CVS carrying, and all of those different companies. Now that they're carrying it, they want to have some ownership in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Becoming very mainstream, and even conservative companies are definitely opening up to it.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And 5 years ago they were saying, hey, there's something interesting here, but we need to learn lots more about it. And I was part of a group of people that they would call on and say, hey, educate me. Tell me what's going on there, and tell me how this is working. And because they, whether it was alcohol companies figuring they're going to lose business to this new industry, so they wanted to protect their so-called market share, to other companies that were saying, hey, if they're using cannabis, they're probably going to, want food or want, different things. So how do we understand? And today it's, in some ways really becoming a data game, in that now we have data on the consumer. So if, I don't know what the percentage of people using cannabis today is, but it's a pretty huge percentage, is now we can study that person. We can know what their habits are.
Mm-hmm.
We can know what their lifestyle is. And then we can start to market and advertise into that. So, you can't advertise cannabis, right? I mean, that's, something you can't do. But you can advertise to those consumers about health and the benefits of all of that, which ties back into what they know about cannabis or CBD.
Understood. Sort of like a Trojan horse almost.
For sure.
So last question for you. You're now working on some projects in the psychedelic space, which I think has a lot of parallels with cannabis, in that it was once looked at as only an illicit recreational drug, but is now being deeply researched for its medical applications. Where do you think the psychedelic industry is heading as a whole? And do you believe it will be recreationally available and become sort of a CPG industry like cannabis?
That's a really difficult question. It's a good question, but it's a difficult one. I mean, I'm today focused on the medical side, right? Especially if it has, if it has any kind of psychoactive benefit or psychoactive effect. So one of the things that we learned early on, and it's true with cannabis, is it's all about set and setting.
Mm-hmm.
So you wouldn't, today cannabis is so strong, you wouldn't just give it to somebody and say, hey, go and, smoke this. If you were going to do it with somebody, you would make sure you showed them how to do it, and you stayed with them, and you made sure the setting was good and the music was good and all of that. I think that's the same idea with psychedelics, right? And so I see that, as we go through this FDA process, that how important that is. On the other side of it, there's the functional business that you're in, Mike, and we see that business exploding because it has no psychoactive effect.
Mm-hmm.
So where is it in between? And in between, it's what is commonly referred to today as microdosing. And it reminds me of, the sort of, early cannabis days where even though it was legal, I could go on the internet and I could order cannabis from all around Canada. All right. And I think the same thing's happening now in microdosing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, again, illegal, but you can buy it on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And you can buy it from, a dealer, right? And so I see that happening, and I see people, telling me all the time, I'm microdosing and I love it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I see that happening. But I'm not sure that I see a legal market in that.
Ever?
Right? Ever's a long word, but I don't see it in the immediate future. Now, if you would have asked me in 2000 or 2002 when I first got into cannabis, did I see a legal market? I said, maybe down the road, but I don't see a rec market. I mean, I see it eventually happening, but I don't see it right in front of me.
Yeah.
And so I could be the wrong person to ask, right? But I think as it becomes more accepted and as we understand more about it and as we put regulations in, that could change. It was like when they came out with, edibles in Canada, they said you can only have a very small amount in those edibles.
Mm-hmm.
So, the black market, you could go and buy a chocolate bar with 100 milligrams in it, where in the legal market, you could only buy it with 10 milligrams in it. So it may be that they come up with, there's microdosing that, you can take that has almost no psychoactive effect, right? It's almost like the CBD of cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think that as we, put research and capital into the space, we're going to find out a lot more about it. And if you look at, all the companies out there, and there's a load of them right now in the psychedelic space, you start with the, functional mushrooms, right? No psychoactive effect. And you go all the way to macro dosing, which, Compass is doing, where it has to be supervised.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, each of them is growing. Right. And part of the thing that I'm so excited about is that, we're making the world a better place. And so, started out wanting to make the world a better place through design excellence. Then it became wanted to make the world a better place through design excellence in cannabis. And today I want to make the world a better place through design excellence and cannabis and psychedelics. Right?
Constantly
evolving. But, what we've just been through in the past, call it 18 months, has brought, mental health and wellness to the forefront.
Absolutely.
And, you see it with your business, and I see it with the businesses I'm involved. People are so desperate to feel better and to deal with their anxiety and their stress and then their sickness,
Mm-hmm.
And so that's driving huge innovation.
That's fantastic to hear, and it's incredible to see, obviously, how cannabis space has evolved since you began, and now with psychedelics. I think it's kind of a brave new world that we're looking at right now, and it's pretty incredible all around. If someone wants to learn more about you or your brands, where can they find you?
I'm a pretty open book. So if you Google me, you can pretty much find out everything. I've done I spent many, many years traveling around the world, speaking to, presidents, kings, queens, and conferences, and was really about, educating everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's lots of that out, where you can see my views and my thoughts, whether it's on podcasts or recorded conferences that I was at. But not hard to find.
Well, thank you so much, Lorne, for joining us today on Mushroom Mondays and giving us a crash course on the world of cannabis and all the health benefits and how it's evolved. It's always great to hear stories like yours in which, someone is trailblazing a path for really an entire industry. So thank you very much for joining us. And to our audience, thank you all for joining us today with our guest, Lorne Gertner. Remember to hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel to get notified when we go live or have a new episode of Mushroom Mondays. I'm Mike Zavet, co-host of Mushroom Mondays with Spore, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.